All right, so welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have you join us for our Ask Me Anything webinar focused on software as a medical device. We'll start by discussing how you can interact with us today. To communicate with us during the webinar, please type your questions into the written Q&A box. They'll be selected generally here for a response. And in case we disappear due to any technical issues, stay where you are. We'll be right back as we can. I don't think they'll be happening today. We've done a lot of tech checks prior to our webinar, so we should be good to go. All right. Christian, do you want to advance the slide along there? Yeah. And then one more. There we go. So our agenda today. So following our introductions, today's agenda will be centered around a short presentation by Christian Kaestner here on software as a medical device, which has been designed around some of the questions that we've received from our attendees in advance. After that, you'll have the opportunity to ask Christian anything you'd like on software as a medical device through the Q&A chat box, as mentioned earlier. We encourage you to post questions while Christian is presenting, and we'll as he will respond to them when we discuss various topics, and we'll choose any particular topics that come in. Another thing to note is if you have any particular questions on a particular topic that he is presenting on, feel free to throw it in the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer the best we can. Please note that this webinar will focus on the topic of software as a medical device as a whole, and not necessarily detailing the how-to within Qualio. So I'd like to ask everyone who keep questions as generic as possible, so that everyone attending can benefit from the responses. We do have a limited hour here, so we've received a lot of questions in advance, so we may not be able to get through all of them within our hour time frame. But at the end of the presentation, we'll discuss again on how we approach follow-up questions, but we will approach any follow-up questions that we have or any unanswered questions that we have in some form of post or presentation of some sort. And you'll receive that a link to that in the near future. We will follow up post-presentation or post-webinar with that information. All right. So introduction. So yeah, my name is Jason March. I am a senior quality specialist here at Qualio. So I've been at Qualio for a little over 2 years, almost 2.5 years. Prior to joining Qualio, I spent around 14 years in quality and regulatory roles within the medical device industry. I come from hardware medical device industry and not necessarily software, but my experience here at Qualio that I've gained since has brought me into the world of software as a medical device very thoroughly, and I've learned something new. I feel like I learn something new all the time, but I've learned a lot, so it's been fantastic, and I'm looking forward to meeting with or going through this webinar with Christian. I'm joined by Lola, who is a senior quality specialist here at Qualio as well. Prior to joining Qualio, she has worked in quality and compliance roles in large multinational and startups across Europe and North America. Lola will be helping monitor the chat today to make sure your questions are appropriately answered. And the star of the show, we're delighted to be joined today by Christian Kaestner. Christian is a trainer with Medical Device HQ and an expert member of the project team authoring IEC 62304, and also has actively participated in the creation of IEC 82304-1. Before I hand it over to Christian, let me tell you a little bit more about Medical Device HQ and how it can make you more confident in the development of your medical device. So Medical Device HQ was founded by Christian's colleague, Peter Sebelius, in 2008, with a vision to help as many as possible bring medical device into the market in the most efficient way. To achieve this vision, Medical Device HQ provides training courses, templates, and coaching to professionals within the medical device industry. Medical Device HQ also offers fantastic resources in the form of articles, which have great insight into all things quality related. A link to the courses offered by Medical Device HQ will be included in the follow-up email after the webinar. But I highly recommend taking a look. It helped me out. I know it's helped other colleagues of mine out, and I can guarantee it'll help you out. All right. Go ahead and next slide, Christian, and feel free to have at it.
It's actually me taking over then, I guess. You called me
Yes,
star of the show. I almost flush a little bit. All right. we have received many questions in advance, as Jason just told you, and I will do my best to answer as many as possible. But this webinar is not only about me talking. Please be active in the chat by asking questions, or why not react with an emoji. So be active, help us out. Now over to the first question. What are some of the struggles SaMD companies have when trying to bring their product to the market? Well, I would say that assuming that SaMD is different from other medical devices is a source of confusion. Many are overcomplicating things by believing that SaMD is very different from other medical devices, and guess what? It's not. Everything you're used to when working with medical devices also apply to SaMD. SaMD must have clinical purpose, be safe, and have requirements you verify against, not to mention the need for design validation. But to be fair, there are a few differences when working with software compared to other devices. Firstly, there is not much of a manufacturing process when working with software. You cannot rely on traditional concepts such as process control or process validation to mitigate risk. This is why there is so much focus on the software development process when working with software. The second challenge I want to bring up when working with software is bugs. You're perhaps familiar with them. If you ever used software, you know it can fail. A software product comes with all bugs enabled. Yes, you heard me right. They are all enabled. Bugs are design flaws you have yet to discover. You haven't seen them, but they are there. Since software is not subject to tear and wear, there are usually no signs of problems before it malfunctions. It just happens, like the infamous blue screen. This may make you nervous, and the cure for that is a solid software development process. So I think that's my two, specific details which make software a bit different. I would like to answer to this question with a second answer as well. So underestimating compliance work and doing it too late. Too often I see companies developing software and starting the compliance part at a very late stage. This isn't good for several reasons. If you want to be effective and release SaMD versions at a high cadence, you must consider compliance work as an integral part of your development work. If compliance and documentation are considered an add-on, you just add when you are close to release, you will struggle every time there is a release. I previously told you it's all about the development process. So please ensure that the development process not only delivers a functional software, but also functional documentation. I hope this makes sense, because too often, as I said before, there's a lot of software development work. You reach a release point and then you start thinking about the documentation. And at that point, you have also failed to demonstrate that you're working following a development process. So try to make it integral in the work and make it as efficient as ever possible. Now let's dive into more specific questions, starting with requirements. And here is one question I've received. Are there 3 levels of requirements needed for software design control? So user needs, design input, and design outputs. You could argue whether design outputs is really a requirement for input, but we will get there. This figure might be overused, but it provides a good guidance on the topic. It provides a relationship between the different terms and definitions. It doesn't say that you must follow the specific order, but it establishes a relation. So look at user needs. Stakeholders want to achieve something and they don't care about the actual technical solutions. So user need can be described as what stakeholders need a medical device to do. For the second part, what a medical device must do to realize the intent of the needs. So you can say this is getting closer to technical requirements, defining what you want the device technically to do. And the design output is, how did you realize the design? So after you developed it, that's the design process, there will be outputs, and that's your design output then. And to make this more tangible, let's have a look at an example. As a diabetic, I want to be warned if my blood sugar level rises above or below, I don't know which is most dangerous, a certain level. That's the need from a user. How this is achieved is of less importance to a user. However, you as a developer, you need to consider, what does the device must do? Probably you're going to the direction of, you need to have some kind of measurement. There need to be an algorithm detecting the levels. You probably need a warning system, and with that comes display and audio. So the design input will then refine the user need into more tangible requirements. The design output is then, if we take an example of a SaMD, it perhaps don't relate exactly, but this would then be how to build SaMD. That could be your build file, your project files, something like that. It includes source code and binary, if you have that, instructions for use, and you could also say accompanying documents, including installation instructions, how to get the software working in the environment you want it to be. To give you another perspective on this, so I can share how I would map requirements in a structure like this. So we have a SaMD device with an app, backend, web portal, and desktop. I will start at the top by defining user needs. If you're familiar with IEC 82304-1, well, that's in that standard, it's called use requirements. I will use the user needs to design a design validation to see if the users can do what I want to achieve with the product. Then I would have a layer which I call system requirements, converting the user needs into requirements. I will use this level for design verification, or what's called in 62304 software system tests. And at the bottom, I would probably have 4 software requirement specification in this case, with separate software verification, let's say, specification protocols. And the reason why I choose to have 4 different software requirement specification is that it might be different project teams, it might be developed on different sites. And I'm also pretty keen to understand whether each of these components are working as intended. And that's why I want to have separate requirements for them and separate verification before I integrate them into a system. If you are into Agile, you perhaps use for the terms epic, user stories, and task. There is no one-to-one mapping telling what it should be, but this could be one alternative. So you use epics at the top, user stories in the middle, and then refine user stories into tasks. If you would like to prefer a different approach, that's perfectly fine. It's up to you and your procedures how to use epic user stories and so on in your system. Well, do you see my screen? I just want to check, but it appears it looks like you see my screen. Lola, Jason, all good? Cool.
Yeah,
I see a thumbs up. Cool. Thanks. You never know. This is silent when you're speaking alone into the camera, but all good.
That's what we're here for.
Thank you. So my answer to this question is then, well, yes, I think the 3 levels are needed because they serve different purposes. Design input and software requirements, however, might be merged for simple SAMD system. In the previous example I shared, you have a more complex system with app, backend, I don't recall everything, but there are many different components in that system. Then it makes sense to have more requirement specification or more layers. But for a simple, let's say you're working on a single app, then I would probably suggest you merge design input and software requirements into one, because there's no benefit of having multiple documents in that case. And perhaps you ask, is that allowed? Well, if you look into the standard IEC 62304, it specifically says that somewhere in the standard that you can merge software requirements and system requirements if you have a software-only product. So it's very much up to you, but I think definitely user needs are used to map to the validation. Design inputs is what you verify against, and then the design output is the result of your design efforts. If you are interested and want to learn more about requirements engineering, please meet my colleague Peter Sibelius, who has created an amazing course on the topic. So really watch it out. You can just click on the link. Thanks, Ashley. So have a click on the link if you're interested in requirements engineering. He has done an amazing job on creating this course. So here comes more on a similar topic. What is the equivalent of design input and output requirements for software? Software requirement specification, architecture, documentation, and so on. You could be a bit philosophical on this topic. So in theory, the output for one phase is an input to the next phase. So you could define design inputs and outputs to your liking. I'm not saying you should do this now, but basically it allows you to define where you want to draw the line in the system. So you have flexibilities. Of course, you can't have design inputs after design output. I hope that makes sense. But otherwise, you can draw the line and define this is design input in our way of working, and here comes the design output. However, in my experience, the split line is somewhere around the software requirements. If you choose to merge system and software requirements, I suggest the combination is a design input. But there is some wiggle room around the software requirement. So let's look at an example. This example uses system and software risk and regulatory requirement as design inputs. I consider the binary code, source code, and accompanying documents as design outputs. And lastly, I would suggest to say that software architecture and design documentation are process outputs, but I don't include them as design outputs because I don't want them in my DMR or medical device file. So they're definitely output of your design process. So you could say they are design outputs, but often when you talk about design output, that means you kind of imply that should be in your device master record or something like that. And I don't think the software architecture and design documentation, I don't add in value in being placed in those files. But again, it's all about where you draw the line. I've drawn the dotted line through the figure. You can choose where you want to place that one, but in my world, I don't include software architecture and design documentation as design outputs in that case. Okay, that was all for the requirement part. So before we jump in and talk about software risk management, do we have any questions I need to deal with?
Yeah, Christian, one actually came in with respect to, I believe this is related to what we just discussed, but so how are constraints for software established? At what stage do we need to establish this? And till what phase in design can the constraints be revised, updated? I believe this is related to how you develop constraints around the design inputs from the needs, but that's my interpretation. I'm going to let you take that.
Is it fair? You probably have to help me a bit here with my Swinglish. I know I live in Sweden, so English is not my native language. I hope you already, I guess you already guessed that. But you say constraints. Should I interpret that as requirements when you need to lock the requirements? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not. I'm speaking for the
Yeah.
participant here, but I'm assuming that constraints around. So if you have a software, you have to know kind of the like if it's a maybe AI, for example, how do you design like how far it can go? That's how I'm taking it. I could be completely wrong.
I might answer to the wrong question now. Please feel free to rephrase the question then, whoever asked it. So if you're working in an agile environment, this is a very common question. how far can you take it without having all requirements in place? And I think you shouldn't start designing something without the appropriate requirements being in place. So whenever you start designing something, a part of your system, I think it's wise to have a requirement established at that point, but then you can always refine them when you learn more. So the last point in time, I would say the requirements must be defined is before you start testing them. So that
They clarified constraints as in design boundary for the requirement.
So design boundaries for the requirements. As I said, in the agile approach, I never consider requirements being locked. I always work with requirements. So the constraints you have in place, they can move. So I think there's a lot of flexibility, but you need, as I said, you need to lock everything down no later than when you start testing. Because then you need to have the requirements in place. But before that, you start with a set of requirements. You keep on working, and you can change those requirement constraints related to them, as long as you do that under some kind of change control.
Perfect. And the next question that came in about this is how does this approach for requirement engineering translate for software embedded in a medical device?
I guess you probably mean for the requirement engineering course I suggested. Well, I would say it's a generic course. Peter also talks about software and that, but I think it does a great job in refining, explaining user needs, design input, and subsystem requirements. And since it's talking about subsystem requirements, well, that's basically software as well. So I think it's doing a great job. So please click on the link and have a look. There's a pre video you can look at to get a first impression. Yep, thanks.
Perfect. All right. All right. Should we move on? Lola,
Sure.
do we have any other ones that came on that one?
No, I think it's good to go to the next topic, and I'll keep monitoring.
Cool. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. This one is pretty popular. So software risk management, and I've added a subtitle here. So developing safe product is crucial, but don't harm yourself in the process. And it perhaps sounds a bit awkward, but I've seen many approaches to software risk management leading to an amazing amount of work, and that's almost harmful in itself. So it could go overboard, and I'll try to suggest an approach to software risk management which will help you, guide you, and hopefully make sense to you. Here is a quite long question. So software FMEA, taking, for example, SRS, I take that as a software requirement specification saying software shall validate email entered by use. And there are two different alternatives here. So when using Agile, the suggested is to have a sprint FMEA, and B, others I've seen is that each function in the Windows is analyzed and possible failures are raised. And what is my experience? I might disappoint whoever asked this question because I think FMEA is not software risk management in my opinion. And some of the reasons for that is that when working with an FMEA, you should have probability of detection or detectability, and that might be questionable when working with software because software failure is often very unexpected and comes without warnings. So when a failure is detected in software, it's kind of often too late. You don't get any pre-warnings at all. And in other products, detectability might be very useful because you can listen, you can hear, you can notice that something is going wrong. When software, when you see the blue screen, well, you're lost. And there's also another missing part when working with failure mode effects analysis, and that is there's no linkage to harm. And that makes the linkage to system risk management, ISO 14971, it's missing. So you need to deal with that linkage somewhere to make an FMEA approach equal to software risk management. And lastly, FMEA is all about failures. However, risks may also be a result of a functional software. So what if the user misunderstands information correctly displayed? So everything is working, but the user is still doing something wrong. And that's also could be considered a cause. The software is causing trouble for the user, and that could lead to risk. So I think FMEA is kind of limited in scope, still a very useful tool. So what I would like to suggest is that you work with software risk management in relation to your system risk management work. So this approach is then following software risk management following IEC 62304. And that is about identifying how the software can contribute to hazardous situations. And this is achieved by identifying how software items through causes can contribute to these identified hazardous situations. And this approach provides a traceability between software and the system risk management. And that's something I think is quite crucial, because you know what's risky from the system risk management, and you want to address those risks you have identified. And here, tools like FMEA and a fault tree analysis can help identifying causes. So it's still helpful tools to drive and identify causes, but I wouldn't purely rely on those tools as software risk management tools. It's a long answer to this simple question, but I want to set the stage before we get into discussing cybersecurity and AI as well in relation to risk. Where to document your software risk control measures is a matter of taste. For a small SAM product, adding them to the system risk management documentation might be beneficial, because it basically results in less documentation to maintain. But I would ask you to be careful about risk evaluation. Don't do that in the software domain, because I recommend you keep risk evaluation in one place, in the system risk management documentation, because risk evaluation can't be done by looking at partial information. You need to see the full picture. And by partial information and full picture, I mean, if you use, even if the SaMD software, it might be a user reading a guidance, or there's a doctor involved taking some actions and so forth. It's not only the software responsible in that case. There might be several, as you see on the screen, sequence of events. There might be combinations you should consider. And that makes it very difficult to do risk evaluation purely on the software risk management level. I often see approaches like this, where software risk management is a copy of the information at the system level. So you just kind of do the same stuff twice. And I would say this is not a recommended approach, because you don't want to have two processes potentially ending up with different results. And with different results, that could mean, for instance, you end up with different lists of hazards and harm. And if this happens, how can you tell which one is correct? And if you choose one and say, okay, it must be the system risk management that is right, that means you confess the other one is wrong. And I've seen this happening when working with clients, that hazard and harm is one thing at the system level, and then there's a list of different harms and hazards at the software level. And I would argue that's not really good risk management work, because, yeah, you have conflicting information. So be careful about having a system which is looking similar to this, because you might spend a lot of time to align the two between. So what I instead suggest, when looking at software risk management, try to focus on item, cause, link to the hazardous situation, and identify suitable risk control measures. So I suggest creating a matrix like this. You can include this one in your hazard trace matrix at system level, or you can choose to have it separately. And here, please note that I intentionally don't include any evaluation numbers here. I save that for the system level. Let's see where we are. If you would like to, I'm talking about software courses, and you perhaps ask, what is that? I would recommend you not listening, reviewing Annex B of IEC TR 82002-1, and because it's a great resource to kickstart software risk management discussions. You see the annex, there are software function areas, example courses for hazards, and the best one you see, let me show with my cursor perhaps, see if that comes through. Yeah, questions to ask. So there's a long list of questions you can ask yourself while doing this work, trying to identify what software courses could trigger problems for the software and eventually the user. So my suggested answer to this one, to the question before, I've just shortened it down a bit. Consider applying software risk management for IEC 62304 and use FMEA instead to help identify courses instead of having that as your single driver when working with software risk management. All right. It's a long answer to actually a long question. I was close to say a short question, but it's quite a long question. So this was the generic part of software risk management. Are there any questions on this part before we move on to cybersecurity and AI?
Yeah, so we got one in, Christian, saying ISO 14971 discourages from the use of detection in risk estimation. So how then do you bridge the gap by just using occurrence as opposed to detection?
As I said, I do struggle with using detection at all. And if you go all in, and this is a long answer, I guess. But the problem with detection is, as I said before, you can't really use that as a mean when working with software because it can fail without any notice and warning. And that is a challenge. And then you're left with occurrence, and that's relates to probability, which also is a tough thing when working with software. And initially, how that's dealt with in 14971, in your initial assessment, you assume that the software will always fail, and then you implement risk control measures in the software, and you then reduce the likelihood or the occurrence of it happening by, well, a relative reduction. You say, if we implement these risk control measures in software, we find it likely to reduce the occurrence to this level. So there's a relative means to reduce the occurrence or the probability of occurrence in the software failing. I'm not sure really I answered to the question, but detectability is kind of too late. It's more reactive, and I think risk management should be proactive.
That's a great point. Yep. Thanks very much, Christian.
Yeah. Do we have anything more on this topic?
Not for now, no.
Cool. So now it gets kind of complicated. Risk management, when you involve AI and cybersecurity, I think the most challenging part is the cybersecurity part, because that's driven by different factors compared to both AI and software in general, because cybersecurity has nothing to do with probabilities, really. It's evil person trying to hack your system continuously. You can't really estimate that. It's just about money and effort. But I'm trying to suggest a couple of approaches how to involve that in your ISO 14971 work. And this question kind of captures the topic. So how to integrate cybersecurity, SaMD, and AI risk management into ISO 14971 risk management. I have a couple of questions on the same topic. This one is similar. So a medical device different components, how to merge them, integrate them, and also how do you cover cybersecurity risks within your design controls and post-market surveillance process. When we get to the answers, I will try to explain an approach to tackle those. So first off, if I'm forced to answer you yes or no whether you should separate different types of risk management, I would answer no. I think you should try to bring as much as possible together, because you will have to deal with intersections to develop safe and secure products. One such example is what you see on the screen. Prompting for password is probably not beneficial to safety in this situation, but it's good security practice. And I know this is probably quite common way to illustrate that you might have challenges where good security might jeopardize safety and vice versa. And this is acknowledged both in the US and the EU. And so there's an overlap, intersection. And this is why I think, should you treat risk management separately for different topics, you might use different tools, but I don't think it's wise to just completely break them apart and work with them separately, because they will meet at some point and you need to deal with that. This is also illustrated in an AMI document, TIR 57, which recommends a secure risk process that is very similar to what you find in ISO 14971. And despite similarities, they may result in conflicts that must be resolved, as I mentioned before. So the challenge you have is security risk evaluation might impact risk evaluation, vice versa, and the security controls you implement might implement the safety part, and the other way around. And this is why I suggest having a single risk management process to manage potential conflicts between security and safety. I will get to AI as well. However, I think you can use different techniques to identify security and safety risks. I think it's valuable to bring them together, because someone at some point need to decide which process wins. I've been working in big companies where they have different departments working with safety versus security, and it's just insane discussions, because the security team, they want to have some features which would jeopardize safety, but they don't understand the safety part, and vice versa. So again, that's why I suggest consider to have a single process, and that process needs to figure out which one has higher priority compared to others. For instance, if you leak, let's say, patient information for 1 million people, that's bad, right? But is that as bad as if you kill one person? That's for you to answer. But there will be questions like this where you need to deal with a security breach or data breaches compared to the risk of harming people. And again, I think that's for each company with each product to decide how much pain can we take from each silo. But it needs to be resolved. And it's not helpful if you have different procedures in different departments and they have different opinions. You would have a lot of discussions. I think it's better to have a procedure dealing with that upfront. So what I suggest as approach when working with software risk management or system risk management together with different components is to have a similar approach to cybersecurity as described for software risk management activities. If cybersecurity risks are likely to contribute to a hazardous situation, consider linking them as you do with software risks. So you try to link them to hazardous situations whenever you feel that these cybersecurity risks are related to hazardous situation, because then you have started to merge and let them work together. Another approach when working with a smaller system is to expand a hazard trace matrix with additional columns, resulting in this example. So you can use check marks to highlight what type of risk you have identified. So I hope you're familiar with this type of hazard trace matrix. We have a hazard, reasonable, foreseeable, sequence, or combination of events. That's a long one. Hazardous situations, you have harm, and you have the probability and severity scaling. You can use check marks like I have done here. So to make this fly, I expect you to have additional documents such as data flow diagrams to capture a system from a security perspective. And to do this, you can get good food for inspiration in a playbook for threat modeling medical devices, which I think is valuable. So I have a read as a ticket going on the screen. If we then continue this example, I hope I've spelled everything right in this example. So if you include, let's say, AI then as well, training data is biased towards large lung, resulting in the ML network overrunning the air pump at high speed. So here I've included AI specific risks in this example, and the last one could then be usability. Here is a human factor-related risk. Human factor engineering is all about minimizing user-related risks or hazards and risks. Excuse me. So human factor-related risks fits nicely into a hazard trace matrix, as we see here. Then you might ask, is there a requirement to identify them like this? Well, not really, but you will probably ask by regulators when you submit documentation for review whether you have considered cybersecurity, AI, and human factor engineering risks. And this could be a nice way to demonstrate that, yes, we have. So it could be a way to capture everything in one document, basically. And please note that reasonable foreseeable sequence or combination of events, it's a long heading, but you can use that to describe quite a lot of information. So I think it's there. So that's another alternative. So to get back to the questions I'm trying to answer, well, my answer to this first one is start with a system hazard trace matrix and avoid splitting your risk management work into isolated silos. And if you incorporate cybersecurity, use supporting analysis methods documents to feed the hazard trace matrix. And as I mentioned before, look at the playbook for threat modeling. I think that's a good source for inspiration. And when it comes to AI, I think I would just include AI risks as any other risks in the hazard trace matrix and don't consider them separately at all. On this one, I suggest a system approach. I wouldn't have a separate hardware risk file, a separate SaMD file, a separate AI file, because again, you need to merge the information at some point. So I think it's better to start from a system approach and you use tools and techniques to feed the hazard trace matrix. How do you cover secure risk in your design controls? I suggest that for design control, I take that as how do you define requirements relevant for cybersecurity. I suggest having a look at IEC 81001-5-1. It's a lot of numbers. Health, software, health, IT systems, safety, effectiveness, and security. And the reason why I point at that standard is that it is structured in the same way as IEC 62304, which makes it a perfect plug-in standard for cybersecurity work. So if you're developing software following IEC 62304, you will have the same activities throughout the life cycle of the development work for security than defined by this standard. So have a look at that one, because I think that will help you in your design control process to identify necessary requirements. And post-market, I don't know exactly the full story behind the question, but I suggest a proactive approach instead of reactive. So, and I think evaluating for adverse events reporting, I think that's kind of reactive. So if you instead take a proactive approach by looking into the maintenance sections of IEC 62304 and 81001-5-1, you would probably be better off with implementing those requirements, because there are requirements in both of them for software maintenance processes. So that will be my starting point. Now it's time for us to see if there are more questions. Time's flying.
Yeah, so yeah, it is. We received this question early on in the presentation, so it wasn't directly related to the topic you just went over, but I feel one can say there is some relation, but I'll ask it and then we can kind of go from there. And at the very least, we've kind of entered into the Q&A time anyway. So it says our medical device comprises various components, including hardware, software, and AI. Given compliance with ISO 13485 and IEC 62304, what approach would you advise for managing complaints and non-conformances? Do you recommend using or utilizing NC complaints forms for every detected bug according to ISO 13485? Or should these forms be reserved solely for major issues?
I would keep them for major issues, because major issues. So I would say whatever you detect bugs, it all depends on when you start tracking them. Following IEC 62304, you should start tracking anomalies, they call it, bugs, when you start integration testing, and then move on to system testing. And if you file non-conformities for each bug you find during integration testing, the software has perhaps not still been released at all, you will end up in a lot of work. So I think I wouldn't go for non-conformity complaints form for bugs in that case. In the early phases, I would just stick with a ticket system. And then when the software has been released, probably to the market, I would start using non-conformity and complaint forms.
Okay.
I hope that
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Christian. So I know we're in the Q&A portion here, so I'm going to move to more general questions, if that's okay with you.
I'll do my best.
One that came through that had several thumbs up on it. If we have a mobile app that only presents the information or data collected from hardware, should it be considered SaMD?
In my world, yes, but I know a lot of interpretation on how to interpret things. I make it pretty simple. If you have a mobile app and that's what you develop, the app is running on a generic platform, and then I would consider it as a software as a medical device, even if you collect information from other sources. So I would consider that as a software as a medical device.
Okay, thank you. I've been asked that before by customers that I work with as well, and it is definitely one that.
But to be fair, there are discussions, and I don't think there should be so much hang up on whether it's a software as a medical device or not. It's really, there are no strict regulatory requirements relevant for that. It's more like I use that more to see what type of standards are applicable. When working with SaMD, you have, for instance, IEC 82304-1, which is a product standard for standalone software. And if you work with SIMD, software in a medical device, there might be the 82304 standard is not applicable, but instead 6601-1 standard is applicable. So I use the terms more to decide what standards are applicable or not, but there are no specific regulatory requirements in my world. Sorry.
Great. No, thanks. I appreciate that. I know Jason has another one he's going to ask you.
Sure, shoot.
Yeah. And I'm not entirely sure of the context on this one, but we'll go with it. Can you give an example of software architecture that you don't include in design inputs or design outputs?
I wouldn't include any software architecture in the design input in my world, because the software architecture is a result of the software requirements. So I would stop somewhere in the requirement domain and say, this is my design input. Then the development work includes developing a software architecture. And as I said before, it's a philosophical discussion what's design input and design output. Of course, an architecture will be the output of that development work. But I would keep the software architecture as a process artifact, and I would keep that in my design history file. But I wouldn't point at it as a design output, because then it might end up in a device master record or something like that, and it doesn't make sense there. So I don't know if I answered your question entirely, but I would definitely not include software architecture as a design input. I would stop before that.
All right. And then, so I'll go with another one here that is somewhat related to the one that I just asked prior. How frequently should updates and bug fixes be issued for medical software, considering the intricate regulatory processes involved to ensure optimal balance between innovation and compliance?
Good one.
I can say that depends. Yeah.
Yeah. It really depends. It also depends on the magnitude of the change you're doing. I think, depending on where you are in the world, there might be different regulatory interpretations, but I think you should always feel free to release new updates if they are considered minor, I would say. So how often? I can't really answer to the frequency. It really depends. But I think there's often a misconception that you can't release a new version at all. I think you can absolutely do that with minor updates. You can definitely update software with perhaps new subcomponents, and you can release cybersecurity patches that usually are considered as major significant changes. So I think that could definitely be done. So yeah.
Great. Thanks, Christian. I have another one for you now.
Okay,
for design outputs, how do you link it to code when most of the time many parts are implied?
Yep. Honestly, I don't. I think when you work with software, it's kind of as stated in the question, it is implied. So what you can do, you can trace it to software items with help of your software architecture. But I would still consider design output. Well, that's the software. If you have a complex system with app, backend, and desktop, as I showed before, well, then you have 4 different design outputs. But otherwise, I would not spend too much time on trying to link my design outputs to specific source files. I would instead work my way through with the software architecture and trace where various requirements are implemented, for instance, in software items. And I will point at that as, if you're interested in details, look at the traceability provided with help of the software architecture. So I wouldn't spend too much time on linking design output to deep down in the source code. I would just point at the design work.
Great. Thanks very much, Christian. I'll pass it back over to Jason.
Sure. Yeah, so another one came in, Christian. How should software validation be conducted for SaaS products when changes can occur outside of our control?
That's kind of saying you don't. Just let me check. I think there's a great resource at AMI, CR 510, on this topic, how to validate. I hope I gave you the right numbers now. It addresses that, and basically what you can do is you can do risk-based approach, and you can kind of risk-based approach. You might conclude that SaaS is not useful at all. We can't use it because it's unsafe. Otherwise, you can choose between having regular revalidations at some frequency to indicate it's working. But have a look in CR 510. Let me pull up. While I'm typing, are there any other questions?
Yeah, I can pull up one here. In the scale of severity of harm from 1 to 5, so based on ISO 14971, how bad is security data breach?
So now I found a link. Great. So it is, sorry, AMI CR510. So if you Google that, it's appropriate use of public cloud computing for quality systems and medical devices. I think that could be a valuable resource.
Thanks very much, Christian.
Let's get back to Diana. In the scale of severity of the harm from 1 to 5, based on, how bad is security data breach? This is one of the points where I suggest you have a single process. I've seen solutions where you actually have 2 columns. So one defining harm and one defining security data breach. And that could be a way forward. So in your 1 to 5 scale, you have 2 columns, harm and security related topics. And there you can define how bad you consider something else. As I mentioned before, if you have a data breach for 1 million patients, that might be equally bad as killing a patient. I didn't recommend you to kill a patient, don't get me wrong. But at some point you need to define those, and that's up to you. And it all depends on the type of product you're working with. So.
Alrighty. So since we're really up at the time here, what I wanted to say is I know there's probably going to be a few questions that we haven't been able to get to along with some of the previously requested questions. As I mentioned earlier in the webinar, we will be performing some sort of follow-up. So we would like to conduct a really quick poll with the participants as to how you would love to receive that follow-up information. So go ahead and fill out the poll. We would love to get your feedback on that. And so, yeah, a blog post, video response, or another Ask Me Anything webinar. And honestly, either way, we want to make sure that whatever is the best way that you all enjoy or get the most use out of it, we try to do. And it appears there might be more than one that we do. I don't know. There's some popular ones. So yeah, okay, this looks great. So what we'll do is we'll make sure that we do follow up with the participants with this webinar, recording of this webinar, answers to the questions, and then it looks like it might be a blog post, but this is great. This is good feedback. Thank you everyone for your participation. And we'll make sure to get any unanswered questions and some links, helpful, useful links out to you guys as soon as possible. Thank you for everyone for participating in today's webinar, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And that's good. That's it. All right. Bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye.